Thank you all for joining us. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this program and to remind you that this is a two-part series and to ask you to please remember to join us again next Thursday. We're very delighted at the Merowith Center to welcome Rabbi Garth Silberstein, who is the Rabbi of Beis Abraham congregation in University City. Rabbi has been at the congregation since 2019, and prior to moving to St. Louis, he served as the Rabbi of Knesset Israel Torah Center in Sacramento, California. He's an outdoor enthusiast with an interest in food and agriculture. He led Hazon's Cross USA Jewish Environmental Bike Ride twice. And in 2014, he founded Organic Yeshiva, a learning program combining traditional Torah study with sustainable agriculture. Rabbi Silberstein received his rabbinic ordination from Yeshivat Chovevei Torah Rabbinical School in 2016, and he holds a BA in acting and biology from Bennington College. Rabbi, thank you so much for taking time to teach us. We look forward to learning with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephen, first of all, thank you, Stephen, for inviting to be part of this. It's an honor to be able to be teaching here and really learning with you, I should say. And thank you to Judith for facilitating everything here today. And thank you to everyone for showing up. And I just wanted to, oh, sorry, Judith, were you going to, did you say you were going to do something with the introductions or?
Stephen no, that was Stephen.
Oh, that was it. Okay, great.
Yes.
Okay, so I will just ask because I don't know everybody's name. So at various points, I'll ask questions, and at any point, if you have a question, feel free to type it in or raise your hand or unmute yourself to ask it. But I ask that when you make a comment or you ask a question, if you can just, well, I guess I have your names right here, but so maybe I don't need you to say your name. I'm used to, but I will. But if you want to say your name, that's also helpful. And I'm just going to open before we start our discussion. Before I say anything else, I want to share a cartoon that I saw this morning that made me think about teaching and made me think about specifically getting ready to teach a group that I don't, most of whom I don't know. And whenever I teach people that I don't know, I try to remember the spirit of this cartoon that I just saw this. I saw the cartoon this morning, but the idea is an important one. So someone want to read this cartoon for me? Sheldon, I see you're not muted. Do you want to read this cartoon for me?
Well, I don't know what the first word is. Silicate chemistry.
Silicate.
Silicate. Okay. Can you tell me what that means, silicate?
I think it means having to do with the element silica, or with. Okay. I don't know, but this is exactly the point. This is an unfamiliar. Even the name of this thing that they're talking about is unfamiliar to most of us. The very name of it. So the person says.
So chemistry concerning silicon is second nature to us geochemists. So it's easy to forget that the average person probably only knows the formulas for whatever that is, and one or two feldspars and quartz, of course. Even when, and I'm reading now below the cartoon characters, even when they're trying to compensate for it, experts in anything wildly overestimate the average person's familiarity with their field.
Okay, so I don't claim, so obviously I imagine most of us here don't know even what they mean by saying the formula for feldspar, much less what that is. But these experts in silicate chemistry, which we don't even know what that is, chemistry having to do with silicon, I guess, assume that an average person would know these things. And I don't claim to be an expert in the Bible, but I've spent a lot of time studying it. And one of the occupational hazards of spending 4 years in rabbinical school and a couple of years in yeshiva before that is that I tend to forget that not everybody is going to be familiar with things. I tend to overestimate what kinds of Hebrew terms people are going to be familiar with. So if I use a term, a Hebrew term or any term that you don't know, please don't be embarrassed to jump in and ask me to define it. I'm sure if you don't know what the word I just used means, somebody else doesn't know what it means either, and you'll be doing them a favor as well as yourself. So I apologize in advance that I will probably forget to translate every term that I use in Hebrew, and I ask you to help me out by reminding me to do that. So here we are. I'm sharing my screen now, and this class is called Sacrifice, Sorrow, and Salvation, because this has to do with the biblical passage that we're going to read together. And I want to do a very close read of this biblical passage, which is read every year in Jewish synagogues on Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year. But before we even look at the passage or even find out what the passage is, I want to ask you, ask the question, what would you expect to be the biblical passage that would be read in synagogues on the Jewish New Year, on Rosh Hashanah? And if you know what we read from the Torah, we read on Rosh Hashanah, on the New Year. Pretend you didn't know what we read. What would you expect to read on Rosh Hashanah, on the Jewish New Year? And feel free to unmute and jump in. What kind of a passage would you expect us to read?
The story of the creation.
Okay, the story of creation, right? On Rosh Hashanah, on the Jewish New Year, we're celebrating the anniversary of the creation of the universe. So maybe we read a story about the creation of the universe, the first chapter of Genesis. That would make a lot of sense. Anyone else have a suggestion?
Jonah, Jonah.
Oh,
The story of Jonah.
the story of Jonah. Why? So interesting. We actually do read the story of Jonah on Yom Kippur, on the Day of Atonement, 10 days. What, anything in particular about Jonah that made you feel it's an appropriate reading?
You can run, but you can't hide. God sees you.
Okay, you can run, but you can't hide. That's sort of one of the essential messages of Jonah. And maybe that would be just as appropriate to Rosh Hashanah, the day of, which is not just the New Year, but the Day of Judgment, as it is to Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. Any other suggestions of, if you were making up the liturgy for Rosh Hashanah, what passage from the Torah would you have us read?
All the sacrifices and stuff that are in the Torah about what you're supposed to do on Rosh Hashanah.
All the descriptions of the sacrifices in the Torah, of the sacrifices you offer on Rosh Hashanah. Okay, that would be, most holidays we read about the sacrifices that are offered on that holiday. So why not? Why should Rosh Hashanah be any different? Any other suggestions?
Maybe just going all the way back to Abraham, the story of Abraham, because he was the first Jew, and we're coming together as a Jewish community to celebrate our beginning.
Okay, so maybe we should have a story about, we should read one of the stories about Abraham. Because as you mentioned, Abraham was the first Jew, really the beginning of monotheism and the beginning of our religious community. So that maybe that's what we would read on Rosh Hashanah, on the New Year. Now there are a lot of different stories from Abraham's life. Lori, do you have any suggestion for a specific story from Abraham's life that you would like to see, you would think would be a fitting reading for Rosh Hashanah?
All right, love you.
And pretend you don't, if you already know what we read on Rosh Hashanah, pretend like you don't know.
At 3 o'clock, I should put them on with
You're muted if you're saying something.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. You'd think by now we would all remember to unmute ourselves.
I think the sentence I say more often than any other in my life is "you're muted."
Yeah, you're right. There are quite a few Abraham stories to choose from. So, I mean, I don't know if it fits Rosh Hashanah. My favorite Abraham story is, Lech Lecha, go to the land that I have shown you, but I don't know if that fits in with.
Yeah, you can make a really strong argument for Lech Lecha. That's the first real story about Abraham's life, where God says to Abraham, go to the land that I'm going to show you. And the Hebrew phrase Lech Lecha literally means go to yourself. Go become the person you were meant to be by going to the land that I'm going to show you. And, there's a famous interpretation that, what separated Abraham, that he merited to hear that voice, that God said that to him, to the land when no other human being had gotten that commandment before. And the answer, according to Sfas Emes, one of the great Hasidic commentators, is God had been giving this message to everyone since the dawn of creation. Abraham was the first one to hear it. And so on Rosh Hashanah, when we have this, one of the central commandments is to hear the sound of the shofar, we can read a passage about someone who stopped to hear what God was saying. So, Lori, you're close in terms of what we focus on, but it's not that we read a story about Abraham, but we, now let me see if I can get this to my screen to advance. My slideshow does not want, oh, there we go. We don't read the story of Lech Lecha, the chapter 21 from the book of Genesis, which is a very different story from the life of Abraham, and one that Abraham is not really at the center of. And I think if any of us in this room, whatever our level of familiarity with the Torah and with the Bible, we would not have picked this passage, the reading for Rosh Hashanah. If someone put us in charge of what should the Jews read in synagogue on the Jewish New Year. Let's read this story. And one of the questions that I invite you to think about as we read the story is, why was this passage chosen for the Torah reading for Rosh Hashanah? This is the Torah reading of the first day of the Rosh Hashanah. And another question I'm going to ask you to think about is, one of the major characters in this passage is Yishmael, Abraham's oldest son, that he had with the maidservant Hagar. And it's a little bit ambiguous within this passage just how old Yishmael is. And so I want you to, without any knowledge that you might or might not have from other passages and from context, just based on the way that Yishmael is spoken in the story, ask yourself, how old do you think Yishmael is? Okay, so with that, I also want to make one other preliminary note, and then we're going to get started. A word about words. So in English, if you were in English literature, repeating a word multiple times in a short passage is bad writing. But in biblical Hebrew, repeating a word frequently within the same passage is a matter of indicating is actually part of classical biblical Hebrew style, and the repetition of words within a passage often provides clues about the underlying themes or meaning of the passage. So as we read the story, the passage that we read on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, we're going to be keeping track of words that are frequently repeated and seeing if they provide any clues to its meaning or its themes. All right, so here we are. Without further ado, Genesis chapter 21. Who would someone like to read verses 1 to 3 here for me? Or I can read. So we read, and the Lord visited Sarah, or as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had spoken. For Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the set time of which God that was born to him, whom Sarah bore to him, Yitzchak. So looking at this passage, does anyone notice any theme words that seem to be repeated? That are repeated that might be providing us a clue to the themes of this story.
Born, the word born.
Okay, so here we have the word born. The Hebrew word is to be born. The passive is to be born, nolad. And so we have the word born, which appears twice, and 3 times. Sorry, the word born, and any other words?
Okay.
Spoken, yeah. So we have the word spoken, which appears, which does appear multiple times. The Lord appeared to Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had spoken, at the time which God had spoken to him. So there seems to be a repetition of the word speak. I'm not going to actually track the number of the word speaking or saying, which in Hebrew are amar and diber, because there's such frequent words in the Torah, it's very hard to know if they're being repeated a lot just because everything in the Torah is about someone saying something to someone. They're being repeated a lot because they are, you're right, that word is repeated a lot, and I'm not saying it's not one of the theme words, but I made an editorial choice not to track speaking as one of the theme words in this passage, just because, again, it's such a common word in the Torah. It's hard to tell when it's being repeated to tell us something or when it's just it's just being repeated because it's a very common word. Sarah. So Sarah's name is repeated 3 times. Abraham only 4 times. Abraham only twice. I'm making a choice that, except for names that are used, names that are also used to mean something other than a proper name, I'm not going to track names as theme words. That's another editorial choice that I made. But we will note Sarah is repeated a lot in this passage. Abraham is repeated twice. Sarah 4 times. Yitzchak's only mentioned once. And I'm not going to track these names for now, because as of now, none of these names have been mentioned as a word. You know, a lot of Hebrew names have a meaning. For instance, Abraham means father of many. It has the word Av, father, in there. But as a proper name, I'm not going to be tracking it as a clue to meaning. Maybe that's any other words that are repeated? Son. And right, so we see the word son repeated twice. So in this passage, by the way, I meant Yitzchak's name literally means he will laugh. So they give him this name that means he will laugh. The word son appears twice, and the word to give birth or to be born appears 3 times. So let's look at the next passage, next 2 verses. Abraham circumcised his son Yitzchak, being 8 days old, as God had commanded him. And Abraham was 100 years old when his son Yitzchak was born to him. So any new repeating words or words that we saw in the previous passage that are showing up more times here?
Son.
So we have son, and son, actually, you might think, how many times do you think son appears in this passage? It's a trick question. So in the English, the word son appears twice. But in Hebrew, the word for son is bane. And in addition to the times when we have the word son translated, the way you say how old someone is in Hebrew is you say they are ben, a son of, or in the case of a woman, bat, a daughter of that age. So when it says Yitzchak being 8 days old, it's Yitzchak ben, a son of 8 days. And when it says Abraham was 100 years old, and we also see the word born one more time. Okay, let's look at the next passage. So Sarah makes a comment now about her son. She says, Sarah said, God has made laughter for me so that all that hear will laugh with me. And she said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah should give children suck? For I have borne him a son in his old age. And the child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the same day that Yitzchak was weaned. So we have a couple of words that are already on our list of theme words, son, and son, which appears twice, and we also have the word yeled, which means birth, but also child appears twice. So now we have the word yeled, birth or child, appearing 6 times, and the word son has now appeared 8 times in this passage. And I want to point out that at this point, we see this word to laugh being repeated. And the word for laughter is the same root in Hebrew as Yitzchak's name, as I mentioned before. Yitzchak's name means he will laugh. So we have that word appearing 3 times in this passage, which means that Isaac's name has appeared 6 times total. Now, so we're you keeping track at home, our big theme words so far are son, child, and laughter. Because now that Yitzchak's name is being used to mean something other than his name, I'm going to track that as one of our major theme words. Okay, let's keep reading. And so now we're going to introduce the conflict. So far, this exposition, and now we get some conflict. Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham. There's that word. We have the word son. We have the word born. Mocking. Now, the Hebrew word for mocking here, that's translated in English as mocking, is mitzachek. And it's an intensive form of the same verb that means to laugh. So, and it's again related to Isaac's name. So Sarah, whatever, it's unclear what exactly Hagar's son was doing. There are different explanations. One, he was teasing Isaac. That might be the surface level. There's explanations that he was abusing Isaac in some way. But the one interpretation that I really love is that it says Hagar's son was mitzachek. He was Isaacing. He was pretending to be Isaac, or acting as though he were Isaac. And whatever it is that he was doing, Hagar's son, Sarah doesn't like it. So she said to Abraham, cast out this bondwoman and her son. There's that word son again. For the son of this bondwoman shall not be heir with my son, with Yitzchak. So we see the word son over and over again, being repeated more times than would be necessary to convey the meaning of the passage. Sarah could have just said Yitzchak. She didn't just say my son, Yitzchak. And she could have said, cast out this bondwoman and her son so that he will not be heir with my son. Why did she repeat the word son? So the Torah is trying to tell us something through the repetition of this word son, which brings our total uses of to 12. Yeled, or childbirth, appears once in this passage, bringing our total to 7 times. Isaac's name, or laughter, appears twice in here, both in the word mitzachek, mocking, and in Isaac's name. So that's shown up 8 times now. So based on how much, but now we're going to change focus here. Because Sarah's just told Abraham to banish his concubine, their maidservant, and her son, who's his son. And so Abraham does not like this. The thing was grievous in Abraham's eyes because of his son. And God said to Abraham, let it not be grievous in thy sight, let it not be evil in your sight because of the lad. Here's a new word. The Hebrew word is na'ar, which means youth. It's another word for different than son or child. And because of your bondwoman. In all that Sarah has said to you, hearken to her voice, listen to her voice, for in Yitzchak shall thy seed be called. And also of the son of the bondwoman will I make a nation, because he is thy seed. So we have the word son appearing again. Yitzchak. So 2 more times the word son appears. Yitzchak appears once, 9 total. Any other theme words that people are seeing repeated a lot that they're catching their attention? Okay. We can continue here. Oh yeah, and then the word lad. It's not repeated, but I want us to take note of it because this is going to be a significant word. Lad, or youth. And my teacher, Judy, points out that you can tell what people think about Yishmael by how he's referred to when they speak or when they're the subject. So depending on who's the subject of the verse, this person is referred to differently. When he's in the Abraham, he's referred to as his son. In the previous passage, Sarah refers to him as the son of Hagar and the son of this bondswoman. So for Sarah, he's Hagar. He's that slave woman's son. But for Abraham, he's Abraham's son. So Sarah doesn't see this as her husband's son. She sees this as the servant woman's son. While Abraham sees the child as his own son. And interestingly, when God speaks, he refers to him not as anybody's son, but as the lad, the young man. Not anybody's son, but a young man with in his own right. Not your lad, not Hagar's lad, the lad, someone with his own identity. Okay.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
Oh, can you go back to the slide you were on.
Yeah.
God also calls both of the boys thy seed. So he also refers to them as Abraham.
Right. So right. This word seed, which literally in the Hebrew is literally seed, but offspring. Both Isaac and Ishmael, whose name has not been mentioned in this passage, but both of Abraham's children are referred to as Abraham's seed. But it's interesting. There seems to be a distinction because he says, Abraham saying, "Don't worry about banishing Ishmael, because your seed is going to be called, your seed is going to be called in Isaac," which seems to mean your legacy will be Isaac. But Ishmael, the Hagar's son, he's also your seed. So it seems Abraham has multiple legacies, but Ishmael is Abraham's offspring, but Isaac is the one that shall be called Abraham's offspring. So there's something about the way that they're, maybe in point of fact, they're both equally Abraham's sons, but something about Isaac, the way they are known in the world, Isaac is the one that is going to be called the offspring of Abraham. That's where Abraham's legacy lies. Thank you for pointing that out. Okay, let's keep reading. So Abraham rose up early in the morning. So this already tells us something about Abraham's character, because if you told me I had to send away two people whom I loved, who were part of my family, I wouldn't be in any hurry to do it. But Abraham gets up early in the morning to do it. Okay, so sorry, I'm seeing in the chat someone saying maybe Ishmael's crime, this mitzachek, meant that he was mimicking Isaac in a taunting way. I think, yeah, that's possible. Maybe he was mocking, but also Isaacing. So he was mocking by imitating Isaac. I like that. And then you pointed out the word nar in Yiddish means a fool. It's not etymologically related there. This is nagar with an ayin, which means a young man. Nar in Yiddish has no. It's a homonym, or it sounds similar to nar in Hebrew, but it actually is not a related term. Yes, it's, that often. The Yiddish word nar is not related to the Hebrew nagar, or young man. So the Torah is not calling Ishmael or an idiot, which is what the Yiddish nar would be. And Deborah also points out that Abraham, this isn't the only time Abraham gets up early, right? Abraham multiple times in the Torah gets up early, and we're going to read about this next week. This is maybe a link between the Torah reading for this early, because in the next the passage we're going to read next week, which is the Torah reading for the second Rosh Hashanah, Abraham also gets up early to sacrifice his son Isaac. So Abraham seems to be someone who gets up early in order to do unpleasant tasks. And he takes bread and a bottle of water, and took bread and a bottle of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder and the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. So we have this word child, yeled, here. Which is related to the word for giving birth. It's the only theme word in that passage. Yeled, child. Okay. So then what happens? The water was spent in the bottle, and she, Hagar, cast the child under one of the shrubs, and she went and sat a good way off, as it were a bow shot. It's a strange way to describe a distance. She was a bow shot away. For she's so here we have the word child being repeated again. And she sat over against him, and she lifted up her voice, and she wept. So I'm just curious, what do we make? What do we make of Hagar's behavior here? What is she? Why do you think she's doing here? A strange thing. It's not necessarily what you would expect of a parent with their child dying of thirst in the wilderness.
Well, I'm just following along in Art Scroll, and Art Scroll says, oh, this is disgusting, but disgraceful behavior and indicative of her flawed Hamitic character.
Okay, so we could read this and say, this is clearly a deeply morally flawed person. She's abandoning her own son to die of thirst, and she would rather she'd rather let him die alone than have to witness his suffering. Anyone else have that's certainly one way of reading it. And anyone, any other thoughts about why Hagar is doing this? Yeah, I mean, it's hard to understand why she would walk away from her son, but maybe really it's too much to bear. I mean, her son. So if her son is really at the point where he's, if we want to read it charitably, let's say we want to read it charitably. We want to think Hagar is not the worst person in the world. She's, after all, the mother of Abraham's child. She can't be so bad. Or what was she? How might we read this charitably, giving Hagar the benefit of the doubt? I'll suggest perhaps the boy's already passed out. Perhaps he's already lost. I'm going to walk away because it's too painful for me to see, and he doesn't know the difference anyway. Now, we can say that or not. The truth is that from people I know who work in hospice care and work in chapel hospitals tell me that it's clear that hearing is one of the last faculties to go. So even someone who seems unresponsive can often hear what's happening in the room. And it's why it's very important in a hospital setting that visitors and doctors and nurses should not talk about a person who seems unconscious as if they're not there, because very often, just because they can't open their eyes and they can't respond, they still can't hear. And people have described waking up from waking up from a traumatic injury or an illness and being able to hear the things that are being said about them and how horrible it was.
It's enough with it to be complaining.
What's that?
The next sentence is that God heard the cry of the youth. So that sounds like the youth is actually enough with it that he isn't out of it. He's crying, he's complaining, he is suffering, and therefore the idea that he's too far gone to for it to make a difference if Hagar is there isn't to me, quite as convincing.
Okay, right. So that maybe the context argues against this charitable read of Hagar, because in the next passage we read, and God heard the voice of the lad. There's that word lad. Interestingly, the last time he was called a lad was also when God spoke about him. The whole time his mother's been talking about him, he's been the child. So for Hagar, for Abraham, this boy, young man is Abraham's son. For Sarah, he's Hagar's son. For Hagar, he's the child, the one she gave birth to, right? Those are the same root in Hebrew. But for God, he's the lad, the youth. And God hears his voice, so he's obviously not totally unresponsive. And an angel called to Hagar saying, basically, what's wrong with you? Why are you? God, fear not. God has heard the voice of the lad. There's that word lad again. Where he is. Not where you are, where he is. Arise, lift up the lad. There's that word lad. And hold him in thy hand, for I will make him a great nation. So we have here the word lad is showing up 3 times. No child, no son. And now God opens Hagar's eyes. She saw a well of water. She went, filled the bottle with water, and gave the lad, there's that word again, to drink. And God was with the lad, again lad, and he grew and dwelt in the wilderness and became an archer. Maybe this is what's being foreshadowed by Hagar sitting a bow shot away. And he grew and dwelt in the wilderness, being an archer, and he dwelt in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took him a wife out of the land of Egypt. And that's the passage. There's one more story that's an unrelated story about Abraham signing a treaty with the king of the Philistines over some wells. But this is the heart of the Torah reading for the first day of Rosh Hashanah. So any reflections before I want to look at this by the numbers. But any reflections before we do that? Okay, so I made a nice chart. Why don't let's make a biblical interpretation a statistical objective affair here. So I just counted what were the theme words in this passage. And I'm including this chart words that we didn't keep track of because in the end, they don't appear that many times, as well as the ones that we've been keeping track of. So by the numbers, the most common words in the passage are son, ben, yeled or yalad, child or give birth, which appears 10 times. Youth that we saw at the end only appears 6 times. And then we have this word root that means laughter, which is also the name of Abraham's younger son, Isaac, showing times. And then some other words that we might have thought were major theme words don't show up a whole lot. The word to hear shows up 4 times. And even though that word is part of the name of the son who's at the center of this whole story, Hagar's son's name is Yishmael, which means God hears. His name is never mentioned once in the whole story. So the word to hear, we would have expected to show up at least as much as Isaac's name. The word to laugh only shows up 4 times. Some other words that show up a few times are to grow or to be large, in reference to the children and the feast that Abraham threw for Isaac's weaning. Mayim, water. Leshev, to dwell, shows up 4 times, and water 4 times. And then to see and the word ayin, show up 3 times each. So maybe not significant on their own, but together these words associated with sight showing up 6 times total. And then an interesting contrast, 2 names of God, the word Lord, Yud K Vav K, the four-letter name of God, shows up only twice at the very beginning, while the word Elohim, which we translate as God, shows up 9 times. So there's a big contrast. So God is a major presence in the story. We weren't tracking that, but is a major presence in the story, as are all these themes of son, child, youth, and laughter. I want to point out a couple other trends because this obscures shifts in how the words appear through the story. So I broke the passage up into 3 parts. And I made the break based on the use of language in those parts. In the first 11 verses, the word son appears, the word son appears 11 times in the first 11 verses. 13 times. I typed this wrong. The word son appears 13 times in the first 11 verses. Sorry, that 2 should be a 3. And the word child appears 6 times. And that word nar, youth, which we saw with the way God refers to Yishmael, doesn't show in the first 11 verses of the story. And then in the middle passage of the story, really beginning with where God tells Abraham to exile Hagar, listen to Sarai and exile Hagar and her son, there's a real shift. The word son only appears once. Child appears 3 times, so still frequent. And then we see the first appearance of the word youth. And then in the last 4 verses, the last 5 verses of the passage, the word son doesn't appear at all. The word child doesn't appear at all. All we have is the word youth. So we see a shift over the course of this story in how language is used, and specifically how Yishmael is described. He's described as a son, as a child, and then at the end he's described as neither son nor child, but a youth. We also see an instance, a shift in God's role in the story. In the beginning of the story, describing the birth of Isaac, God's name appears in one form or another 5 times. In the middle passage of the story, where God's name appears only once, when he tells Abraham to listen to Sarah. And then in the last passage of the story, the last 5 verses, God's name is back, appearing 5 times. So what do these numbers tell us about the journey of this story, about the arc of this story? It's not anyone want to offer an explanation of the shift in how the language is used through the story? So I think that there's a few ways. One is that the story, I think the language tells us a few things we might not have realized. That one, this is a coming of age story. Someone who was a son and a child becomes a young man. Yishmael in the beginning is only defined as Hagar's son, as Abraham's son, and by the end, there's also a story here about a relationship with God that is broken and then is repaired. God is very present, as it were, in the first part of the story, and then beginning with whatever it was that Yishmael did, that mitzacheking, that mocking, that abuse, God becomes rather absent. for the middle third of the story. And then with God suddenly comes back into the picture with Yishmael when he hears the Yishmael's voice. So this is a story about being in relationship to God, being alienated from God, and then being in relationship to God once again. So I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. Based on this passage, without any other context from the Torah, how old would you say Yishmael was, based on the way he's described in the story? And feel free to unmute yourselves and jump in.
3.
Someone said 3?
He was 40 years old. He was 12.
I don't want any context from outside the story. Based on this, someone said, I heard someone say 3 and someone say 12. Who said 3?
I did.
Why would you say he's 3 years old?
Well, he's a youth, and when he was dying of thirst, his mother put him aside, and if he was older, then he would have followed her, and she went off to the side.
Okay, so he's young enough. Three sounds about right for someone whose mother is casting him down, putting him down on the ground. That sounds like he's being carried. So he seems like he's young enough to be carried, but he's older than I. So he should be. Yeah, maybe 3 is about right. Anyone else have a suggestion of how old Yishmael seems based on this passage?
Maybe 5 or 7.
5 or 7?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, maybe a little older, right? That makes sense if we, okay. Isaac was weaned, so maybe Isaac is 2 or 3. Maybe Isaac's 2 when he's being weaned in those days. WHO said you should nurse your children until 2. So maybe they were following WHO guidelines. Isaac was 2. Ishmael's a few years older, 5 or 7. It was old enough to mock. So maybe a little older than 3. I don't know how many 3-year-olds know how to mock. So although he seems like he's very young in this passage, where he's put down under the bushes, maybe based on the fact that he's mocking, he's a little older. Anyone else have another answer? How old Yishmael seems in this? So the actual answer is surprising. So we read at the beginning of our parsha that Abraham was 100 years old when he was born. So Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born, and he was 99 years old when Abraham was circumcised. This wasn't part of our reading. This is in an earlier chapter in Genesis. Abraham circumcised himself at the age of 99, and at that time his son Yishmael was 13. So if Yishmael was 13 when Abraham was circumcised at 99, mathematics tell us that he was 13 when Isaac was born. Now, assuming that Isaac was at least 2 or 3 when he was weaned, or even if, let's say he was at least 2 years old when he was weaned, Yishmael is going to be 15 at the least in the incidents that we're reading about here. Now, I would not have pictured Yishmael as a 15-year-old boy based on this, our story. Why do you think why do you think that this 15-year-old young man is described as a child? And really, we get the impression that he's a very young child, right? Hagar is setting him down under the shrubs, or casting him down under the shrubs. It sounds like he's a young child, young enough to be carried. What do you think is? And even earlier, we'd sort of brushed past this. But when they're first leaving Abraham's house, what does Abraham do? Abraham gets up early in the morning. There we go. And he took bread and a bottle of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder and the child. What does that mean?
No.
It certainly sounds like he's putting water, bread, and a baby on Hagar's shoulder. That's what it sounds like. Why does it seem like the Torah is going, and it's ambiguous, and the English here does a good job of preserving that ambiguity, because he took bread and water and put it on Hagar, on her shoulder, and the child. So we could say, oh, he didn't put the child on her shoulder. He put bread and water on her shoulder and on the shoulder of the child. But it's a funny way of saying that. And why do you think the Torah chose to express this in such an ambiguous manner that made it sound as if Abraham was putting the child on Hagar's shoulder? So I wonder if is deliberately amplifying our sympathy for the child. We know, the Torah knows that we know that this is the guy who was mocking Isaac, who is the rival for our ancestor Isaac's inheritance, and who's going to grow up to be the father of a nation that's not always so nice to us. And so we might be inclined to not look at him very sympathetically. And I think the Torah, knowing all that, amplifies our sympathy for him by emphasizing by making him seem even younger and more helpless than he is. Another possibility is that the Torah is simply showing us things from Abraham's point of view here, right? Abraham is the subject of this verse. And from Abraham's point of view, Yishmael is still a child. Abraham and for Abraham and Hagar, both of them, Yishmael will always be a child. He might be a youth of 15, and 20 years from now, he'll be 35, but for them, he'll always be a child. So he's referred to in this way where Abraham, even as he's setting them off, Abraham not only sees him as a child, but even as he sees this young teenage boy walking off with his mother with bread and water on his back, just like his mother, Abraham can see the toddler that he once was, riding around on his mother's back. And for Abraham, this is not just sending a young man off into the world. Abraham's sending away his little boy. So I think that this emphasizes the poignancy and reminds us that for the parents, the young man is still, the child is still very much present, even when they're looking at the young man. Okay, I want to ask another question here. Why do you think that Yishmael is the only person in this story whose name is not mentioned once? We see Abraham's name all over, Sarah's name all over, Yitzchak's name repeated. But the person who seems to be at the center of all of the drama is never named?
Because he has no agency, because he does nothing in an active fashion.
Okay, so Yishmael seems to have no agency. Other than that one moment, we know of two things that Yishmael did. He raised his voice at some point because God's angel heard his voice. And earlier, he mocked. He did something mocking and inappropriate early. So he has, but for the most part, he's a very passive figure in the story. Any other reason you can imagine why he's not named in this passage?
Maybe because it's easier not to have sympathy for him. Because if, when you know someone's name, you kind of feel closer to them, or you I don't know, you identify with them more or something. But when they're nameless, you kind of don't care as much.
Okay, so maybe this is about not having sympathy for him, which is interesting because that would run against my theory that portraying him as if he were younger than he is designed to arouse our sympathy. Maybe it's the opposite of what I was suggesting. Okay, and then Deborah puts in the chat, maybe it's simply because he's not part of our story. As God told Abraham, your seed will be called through Yitzchak. Yishmael is just a distant relative, and he's left unnamed, perhaps to emphasize that this is not really his story. It's interesting. It's a lot about what happened to him for something that's not his story, but he's not named because we don't want to. Perhaps the Torah does not want to put him at the center of the action. Remind us that this is a side story. I want to suggest another possible answer, which is maybe, which might be actually perhaps a little bit contradictory to what Lori said earlier. Maybe he's not named not to make us less sympathetic, but to make him more of an everyman. Because what's important in this story isn't Yishmael the person, but that he stands in for something universal here. And that connects us to the next question, which is, why on earth is this the story that we read on Rosh Hashanah? Anybody have any ideas? Why are we reading this story of Abraham sending away Hagar and Ishmael on Rosh Hashanah? Of all the stories in the Torah, why is this the one that we read on the first day of Rosh Hashanah?
Rabbi, maybe it's because you refer to him as the everyman, that God heard the prayer of the everyman, he had compassion on him, and that's part of the theme of the holiday for all of us, that no matter where we are or where we stand, if we pray with sincerity, God might hear our prayer and answer us.
So this is beautiful. So this goes back to what the angel says to Hagar. He says, God has heard the voice of the lad, Ba'asher hu sham, where he is. And maybe this is the phrase that's the entire reason, and maybe I'm exaggerating, maybe not the entire reason, but maybe this is what makes this passage resonant with Rosh Hashanah, is it's fundamentally about somebody who is praying to God, and wherever he's at, worthy, not worthy. He's someone who's done sins in the past. He was mocking his brother Isaac, something for which he was banished. And now that he's in trouble, he prays to God, and God looks at him where he is now, not who he was 2 days ago when he was mocking Isaac, not who is he going to turn into in the future, but who is he right now. And on Rosh Hashanah, we're all standing before God, wherever we are. And it's not all the great deeds I did 2 years ago. It's not all the things I might do someday in the future. It's who am I and where am I at spiritually? When I'm standing before God on the day of judgment, on Rosh Hashanah, that's what counts. God's looking at me right then and there. Just like and if I'm praying in sincerity and out of a sincere desire to return to God and improve, God will listen to me where I am, just as he did with Yishmael. So perhaps that is the reason that we read this passage on Rosh Hashanah, that God is responding to Yishmael where he is. There's another thing that I think connects this to Rosh Hashanah, and that is this goes back to this image that this graph that we looked at. If we looked at the chart of the appearance, am I sharing screen right now? Can you see this graph that I'm showing?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so if we look at the instance of how the word God shows up in the story, God shows up a lot at the beginning of the story when they're talking about the birth of Isaac. And then once Yishmael does whatever he does, God's not so present, just barely. Only his name, God is only mentioned one time there. And then when Yishmael prays and calls out to God, and Hagar prays, suddenly God's back in the picture. And his name is appearing multiple times again. So and these first, interesting, I'll point out and this is the story of the process of sin and repentance, where everything is good, we do something wrong, and it ruptures our relationship with God. God's a little absent from our lives, and then we repent and we return to God. But it's also the story of the pattern of the blasts of the shofar. When we blow the ram's horn in synagogue on Rosh Hashanah, the pattern is that we blast one long, clear, perfect blast. And then we blow a series of broken notes. And then we blow one long, pure note again. And that pattern is a pattern of wholeness, followed by brokenness, and the return to wholeness. And I think that's the story of this passage. We're whole when God is present in our lives, and then inevitably we lose track of God somewhere along the way. We start doing things we oughtn't to do, just like Yishmael. We get lost in the wilderness, and then if we please God, if things go the way they're supposed to go, we return to God. And that's actually the story that is being told every time we blow the ram's horn on Rosh Hashanah. These aren't just random sounds we make. When we say Tekiah, Shavarim, Tekiah, we have this doot, 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 doot. Those long blasts are symbolic of wholeness and being in a relationship with God. And the brokenness it represents all of the complicated journeys we go on when we lose our way before we ultimately return to God. So on this Rosh Hashanah, on this Jewish New Year, I want to pray that we all merit to find that return, to call out in a way that God will listen to us where we are at, and that we can return and mend whatever broken relationships we have with the others in our lives and with God, and be renewed for a year of life, of health, and of peace. Shana Tova, everyone.
Shana Tova, thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. And we look forward to seeing you next week.
See you next week, same time.
Yes. Thank you,
Thank you
everyone,
so
for
much,
being here
everyone,
today.
for your-
Stephen,
you
did you
all.
have
No, I just
anything?
wanted to thank, I want to also just thank the rabbi, remind everybody that we're going to reconvene next week. And thank you so much for your insightful and explanation of this week, of the Torah portion for Rosh Hashanah.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Thank you.
everyone.
Yes.
Bye-bye,
Yeah.
everyone.
Rabbi,
Bye-bye.
Yeah. Who was I talking to?
Who is this? What's your name?
Frida.
Frida. This is Judy. Judy Oliver at the Mirowitz Center.
Oh, okay. It's good. Thank you. Okay.
Oh,
have a good Shabbos and a good New Year.
okay. See you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.